Just give it a few minutes to enable people to realise that we've gone live and the webinar has started. So yeah, I'll just give it a few minutes for that to happen. A few moments anyway. And welcome to those of you that are now, as I can see, flooding in, which is fantastic. So if you joined me last week, then this information at the beginning won't be new to you. But if you didn't, I don't know how many people, I haven't checked the attendee list between the two. So I'm just going to run over a couple of things at the beginning, just to make sure that everybody has got some understandings. Hopefully, though, you will have been on, I'll be very surprised if there's many people who haven't been on a Zoom call in the last few weeks or webinar of any description. So just in case you have, I can see somebody has already discovered the chat box. If you want to chat, then click on the chat box, which will be down the bottom somewhere, depending on which device you're on anyway. But if you want to send it privately to me, then make sure it says all panelists. I'm the only panelist, so it will come directly to me. If you want it to go to everybody, then you can have it to all panelists and attendees. But if you want to keep it private, then that's the best way to be able to do that. This is being recorded, as you should be able to see on your screen, and will be available after a few days once it's all sorted out on the HCSA website, and you will be sent the information about how to connect with that so that you can link up with it and watch it again and share it with your colleagues. But so in relation to that, where recordings are concerned, any comments that come in, anything that comes up on the Q&A box, there's also a Q&A box as well, then they will just be used as questions. I won't be using anybody's names. It'll all be kept anonymous, so you've got no qualms where that's concerned. So feel free to chat away with me and I will do my best. It's, as I say, it's just me monitoring it. So if a bit slow getting to it, that's the only reason why. And I have got a fair bit of content that I want to get through with you today in the time frame that we have. So my advice again would be to make sure that you have got a pen and paper to hand. I'm going to go through a couple of tools again. There's one specific which to me personally has been a life-changing tool for me in my life, and I know it's the main tool that I share on pretty much every training that I do and every course that I do, and working with clients one-on-one as well, because of the significant difference that it can make. And I'm pretty sure it's going to make that difference for you in relation to fears, worries, no matter how big or small they may be. Just again want to thank these webinars would not exist if it wasn't for Fortrus, who has so generously sponsored them, and if it wasn't for HCSA and the work that they've put in relation to promoting and distributing and sharing this with people as well. So I owe huge thanks to them for supporting this and making this happen. Some of you may have seen me last year at the HCSA conference, if you weren't too hungover, because apparently it was a good night the night before. I spoke then about how to use your brain for change, and the information that I shared there would be relevant again today. However, I want to make sure that I share this tool because it's such a practicable tool for you to be able to use and put into place. But that's the main thing that I do. Is I'm a speaker and I'm a coach, and it's about helping people understand how their brains work and how they can make a difference for themselves, especially in uncertain and challenging times, which we are obviously all experiencing at this moment in time. Now, last week's webinar, which I know is up on the HCSA website so that you can access that. Andy, if you're able to put the link in, that would be fantastic if you're still on here live, because I forgot to grab that. I do apologize. Look at that. Perfect. The tool that I shared with you last week was around this triangle, and I want to highlight this whole focus section because that's one of the first things I want to look at today. And the tool that I'm looking at comes from this gentleman, which if you don't know who he is Stephen Covey, who wrote a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of the things that he talks about is the circle of influence. Now, the importance for me around this and this time is that with everything that's going on, our focus can be pulled in a number of different directions. But if we were going to split the things that it's being pulled in between, it's going to be pulled between the things that we can do something about and the other things that are of that bigger concern. Now, those things that are big of concern could be around COVID-19, it could be around procurement, it could be around legislation, it could be a whole load of things around second wave, it could be around climate change, racism, all these other things that are going on at this moment in time, which are huge. So these things are sitting in that outer ring, if I can point in the right direction, that outer ring of that circle of influence. And the thing is when you give that your attention, those things are so big that we can't specifically do a huge amount about them that we can see an immediate change. And when we're giving that circle of concern our attention, the circle of influence actually starts to shrink, and that's what can impact how we feel: out of control, uncertain, like nothing's going to change, we can't do anything about it, so hopelessness can kick in, all of those different things. And that can pull our focus in a way of shrinking it down and making us feel like we're out of control and a very small part of a much bigger picture, which is not a helpful place to be. So the more helpful place to put your attention and your focus, and as I said last week, where your focus goes, your energy flows, and what you focus on expands. So if you're focusing on that circle of concern, that's going to expand by shrinking the circle of concern. But the opposite is also true. When you focus on that circle of influence, that circle of influence expands. And okay, it's not going to eliminate that circle of concern, but it actually means that you're focusing on and giving your attention to those things that you can do something about. And that's what's important for us to be aware of, because one of them is going to be proactive and the other one's going to be reactive. And that's where we need to look at, where are we putting our attention? Sorry, my chair's in the way, let me move. So if we're focused on that circle of concern, then we're going to be reactive, and it's actually not going to be helping us really do the things that we want to do. We're going to be feeling disparaged, we're going to be feeling uncertain, probably doubtful, helpless, all of those things I was mentioning earlier. Whereas when we're focusing on that circle of influence, we're going to be becoming far more proactive and looking at those things of what can we do and how can we do those moving forward. So I would always encourage when I'm working with people, that's exactly where I'm looking them to put their direction of focus. It's not that we're ignoring the circle of concern, because there may be small steps. So there may be things like, if you're concerned about a second wave, for example, what are the things that you personally can put in place? Or if you're worried about climate change, what are the things that you can do? Or if you are worried about or fearful around anything else, you can look at small things that you can do in that circle of concern, but it's making sure that that's not having your whole attention, because it is going to disempower you. It's going to keep you in kind of like a victim space of, well, there's nothing I can do, it's not my fault, it's to do with them and them. Whereas when you're in that, I can't point in the right direction today, when you're in that circle of influence, that will expand, you'll give that your attention, and there are studies that show that the more attention you put in that space, that circle of influence, the more productive you become, the more effective you become, and the calmer you start to feel, excuse me, because you're taking those steps forward. So make sure that you're giving yourself that opportunity to be able to do that and choose where your focus goes. And as I say, this is following on from the triad that I spoke about last week. If you haven't managed to watch that webinar yet, then Tiny's just put the link in the comments in the chat below, so you can go and click on that. And then if you've got nothing to do after this, you can always go and watch that again. So the reason that I wanted to flag that up first is because what tends to happen for people when they're focusing on this bit, when they're in that circle of concern, is that's when, as I say, that's when they can start to feel kind of fearful. And that fearful, that can bring up and it can appear in all sorts of different ways. So it may be that someone might get angry, or you might notice them retract, or they might become despondent or seem aloof. Or they might be snappy, or there's so many different behaviors that can come out of that when fear gets triggered for people. And I think that there is a lot of fear that's being triggered for people at this moment in time, and that's why I wanted to bring it up and have a quick discussion with you around that. Now, to me, there's two types of fear that we need to give our attention to, or be aware of, rather, not give our attention to. The first type of fear is the obvious stuff, when it's the fight, flight, or freeze, when you are genuinely in danger, when there is something that is genuinely life-threatening in this moment, not potentially in the future, but I mean in this moment, right here, right now. So there is something life-threatening for me in my future at some point, because I will pass away, because that's what we'll all do. But I don't have to think about that now, right here, right now. I can see that I'm perfectly safe. So it's absolutely fine. I've got nothing to be afraid of in this moment. Now, when that kind of, if there was a saber-toothed tiger that ran in through the office door, other than wanting to know how the hell did they get through a coded door, I would be, I wouldn't need to think about the fear that would kick in there, because that primal fear would kick in. And that primal fear is about survival. And it's about keeping this thing alive, and it will do everything it can. And I don't need to think, do I need to run? Do I need to fight? Am I going to freeze? Those things will happen in whatever order they will happen. My brain is now trying to work out, okay, what would I do if a saber-toothed tiger came through the door? To me, I have to go, well, that doesn't exist. That's not here right now. I don't need to give that my attention. It's not worth giving any energy to that, because I know that if my life was in danger, my primal fear, which is the first one I'm talking about, would kick in order to make a difference, and do everything it can to keep me alive. But it's the second fear that we tend to give actually far more attention to. And there's the best way of thinking about this is looking at the acronym of what it really stands for. Because the first fear is our primal fear. The second fear is our psychological fear. And actually that does break down into the acronym of it being false evidence appearing real. Now, let me give you an explanation of what I mean by that from that psychological fear. So what I'd like you to do is think about a lemon. Put a picture on the screen just to be helpful. But I want you to think about a lemon, and imagine that you've got a wedge of lemon between your fingers, okay? And I want you to imagine that you can really smell that lemon. You can possibly even see those juices. And maybe you want to bring that close to your mouth as if you're going to drop those juices into your mouth. And just really get that sensation of what that lemon's like. Now, I don't know about you. I've done this exercise, I don't know how many times, but my mouth is still salivating. And I can see there's no lemon. I can see that the lemon is on the screen. It's an image. It's not real. It's false evidence appearing real. It's not there. And yet there was a physical sensation that happened. So this is what I mean by psychological fear, is the primal fear we don't have to think about. It will do everything it can to keep us alive. But the psychological fear creates all sorts of physical sensations. In that instance, I know it wasn't fear, but the thought of the lemon was creating the saliva. And therefore it was creating a kind of false information, which was then sending sensations around this body. So let me know if this is making sense. By the way, you guys were great last week. If you were on last week with putting your hands up, and to let me know if it was making sense. Yes, you've done it again. You're quick off the ball. Thank you very much. Awesome. So, and this is what we need to be aware of, is we need to be aware of how our thinking can create that false evidence. And it can happen in a nanosecond, and quite often we're not even aware of it. And it's very often, it's projecting things out into the future based on information and experience that it had in the past. And this particular tool that I'm about to share with you will help you create a distinction between that. So I'm doing that because that's what it helps you do. It helps you, oops, press the wrong button. It helps you come down the ladder. So this is what we're talking about, and it's called the fantasy ladder. So with your pen and paper, which of course you have to hand, is draw yourself, I know this is a 5-runged ladder, but I want you to draw a 4-runged ladder. And on there, top rung is fantasy, the next rung down is fiction, the one below that is faction, and the bottom rung is fact. And yes, faction is a made-up word by the gentleman that created this tool, who is Mike Cope. And it's actually a far more in-depth coaching tool, but I synthesized it down in a way that makes it accessible for people to be able to use for themselves, rather than having to always work one-on-one with a coach to be able to go work with it in depth. But it's a way of being able to help you when that psychological fear kicks in of coming down the ladder. So the best way that I use it for myself to remember what's going on is that if you think of fact as something that we can all prove, okay, it's something that is known or is proven to be true. Whereas you go at the opposite end of the scale, and fantasy is where you've got mind reads and assumptions and things that are imagined or made up. It's where the future exists because it doesn't exist right now. I have to think about the future, I have to imagine it, I have to make it up. And the same with the past. So I have to think about that, and whilst it may have happened, it doesn't exist right here, right now. So I have to create an image and a memory, it's called a memory, right, of that particular thing. So that sits up there, and it's not that the past didn't happen, but it's that when something is factual or true, it's there's no arguing about it. So even I quite often use the temperature. So I could say that it's cold, but in actual fact, somebody else might find this temperature okay, so they wouldn't class it as a fact. But if I'd got the thermometer, or I could say that the temperature has certainly changed in the last couple of weeks, that's in the UK, in York, if I want to be even more specific, then that's closer to fact. And I would see it as 100% true, okay? But then as you start going up the ladder, faction is where you've got 80% of it is still based in fact, but 20% is where you're adding a little bit of your own opinion, your viewpoint, your interpretation on it. And none of this is bad, by the way. This is all about raising your awareness so that it can help you reduce that fear, to be able to deal with any doubts, worries, whatever it is that's cropping up for you, as I say, regardless of whether they're big or small. Faction is where that 80% and 20% switches around. So you've got 20% is based in fact, and 80% is where the opinion is put in, the speculation is put in. For me, that, if I can point in the right direction, that is where the media sits. Because if you listen to pretty much, even when you've got somebody, so we've had lots of broadcasts, daily broadcasts coming from various politicians, and they give a piece of information. Now, I'm not talking about whether that piece of information is correct or not, but what I'm talking about is that piece of information, that statement that is made is the fact. And I'm going to use that term loosely in this instance. But then the media will then take that statement, and that's when the fiction is then added, because it's speculation from there, somebody else's opinion from there, somebody else's opinion, this spin on it from there. And then before you know it, this what was the main part gets shrunk away, and you've got all of this added information around it. So we need to be very mindful of that for ourselves in our thinking, of how our thinking does that. So we might be given a piece of information, but then we start adding, mainly because the thinking is the first thing that thinking's doing all the time for all of us is, what does that mean about me? 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 It's constantly assessing everything. What does that mean about me? What does that mean about me? So it's always adding its own opinion. So it gets that statement and it goes, yeah, but what would that mean about me? What would that mean for me? What would that mean for my family, my work? Well, it's spinning it all the time. So it's adding its own viewpoint, which is why we can end up scooching up the ladder so quickly. And then by the time we get up to fantasy, that's when there is no fact left. We've made a whole load of assumptions and created a whole story around things that, in fact, we don't know where we are. And then before we know it, and it may not be fear, it may be anxiety, doubt, worry, tension, it may be something else, but it's just worth remembering that this is false. And that side of things is where it's not helpful and not useful for you to be able to be doing. So the reason I started sharing this tool, as I say, this is a coaching tool that was given to me during one of my trainings as a coach. And but I started sharing it with clients because I had a client come to my office one day who works within the NHS, and came in and within 5 minutes told me that her job was going to be, she was going to be made redundant. Because of her age, she'll never get a job again, which will mean she won't be able to pay the mortgage, and she'll probably end up losing the house, and where would she live? And this all just came tumbling out. So if you think about those statements, she's going to be made redundant, she won't get a job because of her age, which means she won't be able to pay the mortgage, and she's going to lose the house, and doesn't know where she's going to live. If you listen to somebody and think about how you might think if you're in that situation, where would you place that person on that ladder? So for me, that's way up here, because there's a lot of assumptions here. The first thing I needed to check was whether the redundancy was a fact or not. Was she being made redundant? So my first question to her was, when will you be made redundant then? And she said, oh, my job's not been put at risk yet, but that goes straight up. So all of the statement that she'd said was all assumptions. Yes, the organisation, and we're talking about 8 or so years ago now, but yes, the organisation that she was working in was going through a lot of restructuring. So there was a possibility of the job role being made redundant, but there was no fact in that. So the moment the thinking mind has got a bit of information and it's starting to scooch itself right up there, which is not helpful at all, because then that's spiraled into all sorts of other things, and it's added another bit on and another bit on and another bit on and another bit on. And then before you know, she's got this whole, this whole fear thing happening that is then just, spiraling things out, and she couldn't work out why she was stressed. So we had a conversation for about 20 minutes, and I at least got her to a much calmer state. And it was her that said to me, how did you do that? I need to know how to do that for myself. And that's where I taught her how to use the ladder for herself, so that she could then start putting it into practice. And the best way to be able to do that, I think, as I say, there's a whole heap of other coaching processes that goes along with it. I've synthesized it down into a very small process so that it can be quick and easy for you. And the first thing really is you need to understand where you are on the ladder. And it's important to recognize that it doesn't matter whether you're at the top or off the scale, as some people realize, or whether you are based in fact. It's not about giving yourself a pat on the back and going, oh, look at me, I'm coming from fact, or, oh no, I'm beating myself up, I'm coming from fantasy. The first thing is just about having awareness. Okay, well, where am I right now? And the way to be able to do that is start with that top question. And the first question to ask yourself is, what am I assuming? And actually, if we had more time today, what I would get you to write down is I would give you a good 5 minutes to just hit pause. And if you're watching this on the recording, then do that. Hit pause and write for 5 minutes. What am I assuming? And it could be about this situation. It could be about work, about family, about whatever it may be, my health, whatever it may be. What am I assuming? And just free write whatever's coming up. What am I assuming? What else am I assuming? What else am I assuming? And what I notice when I do this with people in person in workshops is that tends to come up with really big lists, because if you're assuming something, you can kind of make anything up, can't you? So that it's got no limits, basically. Now, one thing I didn't actually say, let me go back a slide. One thing I didn't say about the bonus of being not here, I can't point in the right direction today. There, fantasy, it's because it's too far for me to stretch. One of the benefits of being up in fantasy is when you're looking to be innovative or creative. So it does have its uses, because that's when you want that expansion. That's when you want that freedom of, rather than, yes, but this is the way that we've always done it. And my assumption from a lot of the information that came out in conversation with you all last week on the webinar and prior to that as well is that's one of the things that you have been doing in procurement so amazingly well. That thinking outside of the box. Okay, well, if we can't get the transport to come and bring it to us or to a depot, can we go there? Or how can we shorten this process? From a supplier contract perspective, how can we qualify a supplier in a different way so that we're not waiting for a long period of time? There's all of these different things that you have been usefully up in the fantasy land of being innovative and creative, and that's when it's useful. But on a day-to-day basis, it's just not. And that's where what am I assuming is a great question, especially if you're in that space of worry, fear, stress, anxiety, whatever the word is that you might label it as. Write down, just stop for a moment and write down, what am I assuming? and complete that, and just keep going until you've exhausted yourself. Take a wee break, you know, have a drink of water, stand up, walk around the office, come and sit back down again, whatever it is. And then ask yourself, okay, so what do I know? If you know that you've exhausted that list, then ask yourself, what do I know? You're looking for the facts. So you could ask, what are the facts? Or what is the fact if there's only one? But being very clear and specific. Now, what I always notice, doesn't matter who I'm working with, is this top list is endless and there's tons of it on there. But this bottom list usually has no more than 5 things on it. Very often it's just 3. And the thing is if I gave you a choice to deal with this big long list, which is, you know, it's you know, infinite, can go on forever, or these 3 to 5 things, which one is going to be more helpful to give your attention to? Which one is going to help you be calmer, resourceful, feel like you've got some level of productivity? I've just been reading some research today actually around that. There's so much information that's going out at the moment, and there's a lot of studies for years, decades actually, around how psychologically we get overwhelmed when we've got, have you ever been to a restaurant and you open one of those menus? I don't know about you, but it's like, oh my gosh, I don't know where to start, especially if it's not broken down into categories. It's that overwhelm. And that's what can happen when we're in assumption. And what they're talking about at the moment with all the information that's constantly coming out around COVID is that's creating that overwhelm. This just too much. So if you're in a position of leadership, or even just with your family, you can synthesize that information down to just those basics, because then if you've got those basics of what do I know, then from that point you can laser focus in, which then goes back to your circle of influence. You laser focus in on what it is that you can do and start making those steps towards that. Make sense? Let's have some hands up. Let me know if it's making sense. I feel like I need to do a quick draw McGraw of how quick you guys will put your hands up. Look at that, phenomenal. Amazing, thank you very much. Okay, so the thing to think about from my perspective is that if there are situations like we currently have where there may not be knowns. And I know some of you may be looking at me going, yeah, Jules, but we don't know what the knowns are in this situation. And I get that. So the key thing there is then to be thinking about, is there something more helpful that you could assume? Because very often the way that our brains work, the way the thinking mind, works, is it will default into what could go wrong mode. So yeah, but what if it falls apart? Or what if we don't get the equipment? Or what if that contract doesn't come through? Or what if that doesn't pay? Or what if the supplier does this? Or what? And it tends to go down the worst case scenario route. Now there's another whole exercise I could do with you there, but I just haven't got the time, unfortunately. But the thing there is then to take a step back and go, okay, well, that's one set of assumptions, but what could be a set of assumptions that I could have that would be more helpful? So, well, you know, I'm assuming this is never going to work. Well, what if I assumed that it did work? Well, I'm assuming we'll never get this stuff in time, because I'm pretty sure, right, if I took the majority, if not all of you, and explained the situation that you've worked through in the last 3 months, and if I took you back to this time last year and said, by the way, you're going to find ways to get suppliers on board quickly, get equipment really quickly, that you're going to be working from home in a far more effective and efficient way, and be homeschooling your children at the same time, you probably would have looked at me as if I was some kind of, I don't know, come from Mars or something crazy. But in actual fact, you've been able to go, well, what if that is possible? And what if we could do that? Or what if that's the innovative side? That's the way that's going to help you. So when those facts are really hard for you to get hold of, and they're really hard for you to pin down, which does happen in some instances, that's what needs your attention. If you focus here, okay, well, what could I assume that would be helpful? And sometimes if you don't know the answers, that's when you can assume, okay, well, I can talk to my colleague about this, or I'm assuming that I could go and speak to this person about this, or I'm assuming that I could, that someone somewhere in the world may have an answer to this, let me go and have a look. So that to me, it's like, whether you like him or loathe him, Richard Branson, when he started Virgin Airlines, his whole thing as an entrepreneur is somebody gives you an opportunity, say yes, and then work out how to do it. And I have to say, there's very often that I've been given or offered opportunities, and unless it was, Jules, can you come and teach brain surgery? Because that's obviously not something that I can do. As long as it's within my remit and ethical, then I'll say yeah. And then we'll work out exactly how I can do that. I didn't know how to do all of this stuff until about 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago. So, you know, I just assume that I'll find a way, which links back to the other side of the triangle from last week, which is around language. And if you remember, if you've watched it anyway, that underneath it, I always find a way. That's one of my mantras, is I always find a way. I may not know how right now, but I always find a way. And that could be your something that's more helpful to assume. So the reason that this is so important for us to do is that very often we get lost up here in this, what am I assuming? And what the thinking mind does, is it goes into catastrophizing. Before you know it, like this client I mentioned earlier, you've got, you know, the losing the house. It's not just a case of the job hadn't even been put at risk. And yet up here, she's on the streets. And her kids have disowned her. It's like, well, that's really not helpful to be thinking about, because it's not true and it's catastrophizing something. Whereas, okay, well, let's look at what we can do. And in actual fact, what we did in that instance was we did look at mitigating around the fact that her job could be put at risk, which it was. However, her CV was already up to date. She was already reaching out to contacts and letting them know what it was that she was doing. She was already aware of what her ideal job was, because we were working on that, so she could pitch for that. She was already looking for project opportunities. So there was already this dialogue happening, which meant she came down the ladder rather, and was dealing with the situation in a far calmer space. And that's what this is about. That's why this will help you reduce that fear. And instead of that taking over and spiraling out and impacting on sleep, impacting your exercise, impacting how you eat, impacting your health, impacting how you interact with others, impacting your productivity, that this helps you come down the ladder and just go, oh, okay, this is what I need to deal with. This is what I can do. This is how I can move forward. Okay, so the three things, but the two main things that I wanted to make sure that I went through today, because I do think that with everything that's going on, and because there are so many uncertainties, people can end up chucking their focus into this circle of concern and be looking at the bigger picture. And it might be, well, what we're going to do from a year from now, or what are we going to do when, fill in the blank. And it's not that those things don't ever need our attention, but it's recognizing that they are so big that if we give those our attention, we become reactive, and that circle of influence is going to shrink, and that's where we're not going to feel in an empowered way to be able to do anything about it. If anything, we're going to feel disempowered, and then that's going to trigger all sorts of fearful thinking, which is just not helpful. Whereas when you're looking at it from that circle, I can't work that one out. I can't do it that way. When you're looking at it from a circle of influence perspective, that inner circle, when that has your attention, that then expands, and you're then more inspired and become far more proactive with looking at how you can do things. So my assumption, obviously I don't know you all individually, but my assumption with so many of you and the environment that you've been working in the last, what is it now, 3 months nearly, is that has had to have your attention, that circle of influence, and you have been looking at what can I do? And you probably found things happening far faster than you would have thought possible 6 months ago. So that's what's really important. And when you give that your attention, especially when your circle of influence comes down to who you're connected to. So the story that Stephen Covey shares in relation to this is of an executive who had a boss that basically would gate crash any meeting, talk over people, interrupt people, put people down, and just wasn't a particularly great person to be around. But he realized he couldn't change the boss's behavior, but his circle of influence was on himself and how he interacted with people. And that's what had his attention. And over a period of time, by sticking that focus there, actually the atmosphere and the culture of the office changed to the point that this boss's behavior changed, because he realized that actually he could trust this person and the team of people he was around. So, but that all came about not by wanting to focus on changing the boss, by this person focusing on their circle of influence. And that's important for us to remember. The second thing that's important for us to remember is around fear, and that there's two types of fear. There's the primal fear that will do anything, it's that fight, flight or freeze that will kick in when we need it to, in order to do everything possible to keep us alive. That's its job. We don't have to rehearse it. We don't have to practice it. It does that for us. So we don't have to give that our attention. So if we are genuinely safe in this present moment, which I am, then I know that if there's any fear that comes up, it's going to be psychological fear. And that's that false evidence appearing real. Remember the lemon, that even though it wasn't there, there's saliva that appears, or you might be thinking that you can smell it. And it's important for us to recognize that so that we can take a step from that and go, okay, so if it's not real, then it must be something that I'm assuming. It's up the top of the ladder. What's going on here? That's my clue. I'm feeling fearful. Okay, well, if I'm safe and I'm feeling fearful, then I must be up the top of the ladder. First thing, write down, what am I assuming? Get all of that out. Doesn't matter how long it takes you, but just write it all out. Then go straight to, or give yourself a little bit of a moment, and then go to, what do I know? What are the facts? And be very clear with those are the facts. And you can, one of my clients has turned this into a table, and what she does is she writes down the thoughts that she's having on one side, and then each box, so she's got fantasy, fiction, fact, and then fantasy, fiction, faction, fact, as 4 different boxes going along. And she translates her thinking into each of those boxes and then challenges it to check that it's in the right box. So that might be something that you might want to do. And this only came up that I noticed that she was doing it in this way recently, and I keep meaning to make it into a template to share. If you're struggling to come up with your facts, then go to, okay, well, what can I assume that would be more helpful? And if you get stuck on this, then pretty much it's just the opposite of that. Well, what if it all goes wrong? Well, what if it goes right? Well, what if we can't do that? Well, what if we can? Well, what if we don't get enough of this? Well, what if we do? You know, factor in both. The thing that this can do is it at least neutralizes. So rather than going into fear, it neutralizes, and you start to think far more clearly. Pretty much all of us will have experienced when we're at a heightened emotion of whether it's fear, anger, anxiety, frustration, upset, overwhelm, whatever it may be, stress, that our thinking, it's proven that it just closes down. Our thinking becomes narrow. We can't clearly think or speak. We can't clearly think, and therefore we're not going to be rational. We're not going to be reasonable. We're not going to be being based our conversation or our thinking on fact. So by doing, if you have to do both of those, it will kind of neutralize things down and at least give you some space to then hopefully start focusing on this part as well. So what I would love to know from you, with all of that being said, is when you're thinking about what can you do, I want you to think about all of what we've spoken about. Now, if you've been to the other webinar as well, you can think about it in that sense. But what I would love to know, and either you can private message me in the chat or do it to everybody, is what is the one thing that you're going to take away from either just today's webinar, or if you've done both, what's the one thing that you can do that you can take away and implement? And you can put simple things like focus on fear, or ladder, or circle, or triangle. There's lots of shapes. Or it may be ask the question, or check what I'm assuming. What's the one thing? And put it in the chat so that I can see that and be able to do that. And as I say, if you want to do it to everybody, then feel free to. So we've got ladder, we've got I will find a way, check what I'm assuming. I love that. From last week's session, I'm definitely addressing my posture and moving around more and help with my focus. That's brilliant. Ladder, fear is mostly a fantasy. Yeah, it is. These are fantastic. That's awesome. Thank you so much. Keep them coming in. And what I would love you to do as well is I would love you to think about now, what is the one thing that you could do today that would celebrate and acknowledge what you've been through in the last 3 months. Okay, so it's not about whether you've done it perfectly, graciously, joyously, happily, easily, whatever, because I'm sure that most of us haven't. I'm pretty sure that I haven't. But what is it that you could do? What is the one thing that you could do? And it might be that you take the dog for a nice walk, or that you just give yourself a break between the computer and the kids for 5 minutes. What's the one thing that you can do? So we've got daily exercise. I have to say I've been doing and it is simply a 5-minute exercise routine every day, and I am loving it. It's really making a difference for me, because I can do it in my PJs, don't have to get any lycra on, which is great. But what's the one thing that you could do to celebrate you, acknowledge you? I love that. I could smile more. Yeah. Do you know, going back to the triad from last week, the smile, I don't think I said this. The brain doesn't know the difference. As long as these muscles move, it actually doesn't know the difference between whether it's a real smile or a fake smile. So it can actually help change your physiology. There was a study done where they got people, there were people who were clinically diagnosed with depression, and there were loads of different groups of them, and they did different things. So you had your control group, your people who were taking antidepressants, some were doing mindfulness, some were doing yoga, some were doing other things. But there were 2 groups that were given a pen, and all they were tasked with doing every single day is to put the pen in the mouth. And a group was told that they had to cover their lips around the mouth, around the pen. And the other one were told that they weren't allowed to touch the lips on the pen. So, and those people, they started to feel better because the pen was forcing these muscles upwards, and that's when they started to realize the chemical change. So the person who said that about smiling, you could sit like that and work like that just for a few minutes every day and see what happens. I worked with a client years ago, and his challenge that he set himself was every time he walked past a window or a mirror or anything reflect his face back, that he was going to pause for a second and just smile at himself and carry on. And he noticed it had a significant effect on how he started to feel about himself. So what are the other things that we've got coming in there? Give yourself a pat on the back for the things that you've achieved. Absolutely. So yeah, definitely. And do that physically. Put your hand out. In fact, every single one of you, put your hand out now. Doesn't matter which one. And give yourself a good pat on the back. Needs to be done. Put more weight on. Maybe you've been stressed and not eating well. A video call isolated family members. Yeah, absolutely. I've got to do that. I haven't got to. I'm doing that with one of my friends and a family member later on. So call family, even when I have no news, make the effort to ask how they're doing. Yeah, absolutely. I love all of that. Thank you. So with all of what I've been said, all of what I've said, what questions do you have, or what do you need to know? What's going to help you, either in relation directly to what I've been speaking about today, the circle of influence, fear, and the ladder, or if it's in relation to the triad last week and anything else that I mentioned last week? Then what questions, and you can either put them in the comments below or you can do a Q&A. So, but yeah, in the Q&A, not do a Q&A. That's what I'm doing. So somebody's put no questions. You've been amazing. I now want a life coach. Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you. So if you want a life coach, I know that there are plenty of coaches within the NHS. Of course, I could sit here and promote and say, come and work with me. And there are coaches within the NHS. It is a function that is there. They have so many different services around that. So it's always worth going and looking. And even if you can only get the opportunity to work with somebody for a couple of sessions, that's really useful. Also, it's really useful to look at what other things they may have available where that's concerned. So thank you very much for mentioning that. The ladder sounds like a good technique to use in meetings. It's the perfect tool to use in meetings, actually. And there's one of my clients who they have it printed off, and they have it, they've got a number of meeting rooms in the building that they're in, and they have it up on the wall, and they have it as their meeting etiquette. So they have a space during the meeting etiquette where they can talk about everything, but you have to frame it up that way. So I'm assuming that, or I think that, or I believe that, or I perceive that this is going to happen, or that's going to happen, or this person's going to do that. So they have to frame it up in that way. And there's the space to have that open conversation, pretty much the same as, as that process. So they do that part first and go, okay, well, what are we assuming? Because as I say, there can be innovative ideas that come out of that. But then we go into, okay, well, what do we know? And get very clear with that, so that that's where they're working from. And it's not ignoring these things, it's recognizing they're there, but it is about going, okay, well, this is where we need to come from. So rather than it being that pure assumption on that sense, it really is about getting that clarity. So yeah, it's a perfect thing to use in meetings. It's a great thing to, somebody asked a question last week around dealing with irate patients or suppliers or colleagues, or I don't know if irate was the right word, so I apologize if it's not the right word, but somebody did ask a question last week in relation to that. And the ladder is the tool that I said would be really helpful with that. So when you, I can't remember, somebody's just said something about calling family members and things, but you know, the key thing is about listening. So what you can do is asking people what, so what are you assuming? And very often what all they want is they want to be listened to and they want to be heard. So if you can keep asking them, so what else are you assuming? And is there anything else? And is there anything else? And give them that space and genuinely listen. Then you can help them descale, I think is the word I've just seen, yeah. You can help them bring that down by going, okay, well, so this is what we know, or these are the facts. And if they then spiral up, it's like, okay, well, I acknowledge that, and this is where the facts are. This is what we can do. Love to be able to do that, but we can't. This is what we can. Let's work from here. So that's why I wanted to share this tool, because it can always help with that de-escalation. So I'm assuming that this has answered your questions, as there aren't any more that have popped in. And I just would like to remind you that this has been possible due to both of these wonderful organisations. So with Fortrus sponsoring this particular webinar, these series of webinars, and HCSA providing the way for us to be able to distribute it and make it accessible. And I'm going to acknowledge both Louise and Andy, who are from both of those organisations, that have been very helpful from my perspective with giving me useful information as to what specifically may be useful for procurement, because I don't work in procurement, as you know, but what specifically could be helpful for you. So my gratitude goes out to them. And if there is anything that you would like to know, I'm going to point in the right direction, which is above my head, then just go to juleswyman.com. There are resources on there as well that you can utilise. And if you've got any questions, then please just message me there. Andy has just put into the feedback form, sorry, has Andy just put into the chat the link for the feedback form. So if you could just take 3 minutes to complete that, we'd be really grateful to know what we can do there. Thanks, Jules, fab as ever. You're more than welcome. Thank you very much. And yes, I hopefully look forward to catching up with you again in the at some point, not next week, I was going to say, but take care and look after yourselves. And I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Take care. Bye now. Oh, hang on 1 second. I'm just saying that, but I've just seen there's a question popped in. That's why I didn't cut off. So sorry, I've not been able to catch the session. Is it available to download? So the recording of it will be going up on the link which is in the chat, which will be easily publicised by HCSA, where you can access the recording of it there. Thank you, Jules. Great insight. You're welcome. Loved the session. Thank you. And the link will be available tomorrow, hopefully, if all goes to plan. If I can get this across to Andy, then that will happen. So yes, there we go. So thank you very much. I will properly sign off now. Take care, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon. Take care. Bye now.